Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff today. A whole collection of articles that really make you think about China's influence in Canada.
Yeah, it's a lot more than just your typical headlines. We've got investigative journalism pieces, some pretty in-depth expert analysis, and even a few glimpses into the inner workings of political parties.
Yeah, it really feels like we're getting some inside intel here, kind of a behind-the-scenes look at how things really work. Where should we start with all of
Well,
this?
there's this breaking news story that just dropped about cyber attacks. They're targeting Chrystia Freeland. She's currently in the running for the Liberal leadership.
Right, right.
And it's actually pretty similar to what happened to conservative Kenny Chu back in 2021.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Didn't they find evidence that those attacks were linked back to China somehow?
Exactly. And this time around, SITE, which is an election monitoring group, they're saying these attacks on Freeland are part of a much bigger disinformation campaign happening on WeChat. Yeah, WeChat's a huge messaging app. I mean, millions of people could be exposed to this stuff. And they even traced it back to a specific account that has direct links to Beijing's influence network.
Wow. Okay, so that's not good. What are the candidates saying about all of this?
Well, Freeland went on X and put out a statement. She basically says she won't be intimidated and that she's going to keep standing up for Canada. And then her main competitor, Mark Carney, he also went on X and said he supports Freeland and condemns any attempts to interfere with our democracy.
So it sounds like they're both taking it seriously, but maybe coming at it from slightly different angles. What's the big takeaway here for someone who doesn't follow this stuff super closely?
I think the biggest concern is that these attacks and the disinformation campaigns, they could actually end up influencing the outcome of our elections.
Right, that's a pretty unsettling thought. Okay, so we've got this potential interference happening in the digital world, but then there's this other story that almost feels like something out of a movie. It's about this underground casino that got raided by the police.
Yeah, this one's wild. It was a 53-room mansion, marble floors, $1 million in cash, vintage mutai. Even Shark Fin Soup CSIS actually thinks this place 5 de Courcy Court was being used to compromise Canadian politicians.
Hold on, how would an underground casino be used for something like that?
Well, think about it. At Akmel, there could have been hidden cameras catching politicians in compromising situations, and there are all these connections to real estate development, which is another huge avenue for influence.
So who's the mastermind behind all of this?
The mansion is owned by this guy of Weiwei, and he has some pretty interesting connections. He's tied to the Canada Anhui Friendship Association, and some of the directors of that association are prominent Liberal Party figures.
Okay, so we've got money, potential blackmail, and ties to political parties. This is starting to feel like a pretty tangled web.
And CSIS thinks this might just be the tip of the iceberg. They've seen similar tactics being used in Australia, where organized crime is basically being used as a tool to further Beijing's interests.
So it's not just about influencing elections, but potentially shaping policy and even controlling parts of the economy.
That's the worry. And what makes it so difficult is that these operations are often run through these informal networks. They're really hard to track and counter.
Let's talk about the money specifically. There's evidence to suggest this 5 de Courcy network might have been involved in funding Team Trudeau, going back as far as 2013.
There are CSIS wiretaps and intelligence memos that paint a pretty disturbing picture. They describe these United Front cells operating in the Greater Toronto Area, and they believe these cells were actively involved in the 2019 federal election.
Wait, United Front Cells, what does that even mean?
It's basically a network of individuals and organizations that work to advance the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, often in a very covert or subtle way. They're known for using all sorts of tactics, cultivating relationships with politicians, funneling money into campaigns.
So it's not like a traditional spy agency, more like a network of influencers.
Exactly. They operate in the shadows, blurring the lines between legitimate activities and covert influence. It can be really hard to tell what they're up to.
And how does this United Front strategy connect back to the 5 de Courcy network and Team Trudeau?
Well, there are specific examples of fundraising events and donations that can be traced back to Weiwei and his associates. We're talking about people who are very close to Trudeau's inner circle, including some prominent cabinet ministers. There was even a U.S. congressional report that called some of these cash for access meetings a Chinese state-backed plot.
Wow, this is really heating up. So we've got potential election interference, shady dealings at an underground casino, and now allocations of direct funding of a political party. What's the big picture starting to look like here? Yeah, it's a lot to unpack for sure. And it's not just about one party or one election. There's evidence that the Conservatives have been targeted as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There was this big controversy during the 2021 election. It involved a Chinese-Canadian official within the Conservative Party, and this official started raising concerns when Erin O'Toole, the party leader at the time, started rising in the polls.
Interesting. Why would someone within the party be worried about their own leader becoming more popular?
Well, it seems like O'Toole's stance on China was making some people nervous. There are internal emails that show real apprehension among certain party members about how his views might impact their relationship with Beijing.
So what happened to this official?
The party ended up launching an investigation and they removed the official. They found evidence of interference in nomination contests, and there were suspicions that this person was actually trying to support candidates who were more aligned with Beijing's interests.
Wow, so potentially trying to shape the party from the inside. Does this connect back to anything we've already talked about?
Absolutely. This incident was actually mentioned in the Hogue Commission's findings. They had received warnings from CSIS about the PRC specifically trying to interfere with O'Toole's campaign.
Right, and O'Toole himself said he suspected there was a pro-China faction within his own party.
Yeah, he even admitted that he felt uncomfortable discussing certain policy issues around some members because of their perceived ties to Beijing. And then there was that strange press conference after the election where a group from the Markham area came out defending China and criticizing Canada for speaking out against Beijing.
It's almost like there are these two competing narratives, one focused on countering China's influence and another that's much more aligned with Beijing's interests.
It's complicated, for sure, and it shows how vulnerable both of the major parties are to these kinds of tactics. It's not about being partisan, it's about protecting our entire democratic system.
Okay, so this is clearly not just a recent thing. Are there any historical examples that can help us understand how long China has been interested in influencing Canada?
Well, this takes us back to 1997. There was this really controversial report called Sidewinder. It basically got buried, but the allegations in it were explosive.
What did Sidewinder uncover?
It alleged that Chinese triads with links to Beijing's intelligence services were infiltrating the port of Vancouver.
Whoa.
Yeah, and the report raised concerns about Costco, the Chinese state-owned shipping giant, and it warned that dismantling Canada's ports police would make the country even more vulnerable.
That's a pretty serious accusation. What happened to the report? Why was it suppressed?
So Michel Junot Katsuya, he's the former CSIS intelligence officer who actually wrote Sidewinder. He claims that he was ordered to destroy all the evidence.
What?
Yeah, and he also says that ASERT, the intelligence watchdog, failed to properly investigate this whole cover-up.
So we've got allegations of Chinese triads infiltrating a major Canadian port, a potential cover-up within CSIS, and a failure of oversight from the intelligence watchdog. It's hard to believe this is all just swept under the rug.
It's a disturbing story, and it really makes you question how seriously Canada has taken these threats in the past. Some people even believe that ignoring those early warnings contributed to some of the problems we're facing today.
Like what specifically?
Well, think about the fentanyl crisis, for example. There are concerns that Chinese criminal organizations have been playing a major role in trafficking fentanyl into Canada. And so experts point to the infiltration of ports, as highlighted in the Sidewinder report, as a potential contributing factor.
So you're saying that the seeds of some of our current problems might have been planted decades ago, and that there's a direct link between those warnings and the situation we're facing today.
That's one way to look at it. It definitely raises questions about whether Canada has learned from past mistakes and whether we're doing enough to protect ourselves now.
Speaking of learning from the past, what about the Hogue Commission? They were tasked with investigating foreign interference, so their findings must have addressed all of this directly, right?
Well, the Hogue Commission's final report, it got a pretty mixed reception. On the one hand, it did acknowledge that foreign interference took place in the 2019 and 2021 elections.
Okay.
But on the other hand, it didn't really focus on China's role as much as some people expected. It seemed to highlight India as a bigger concern.
So some people saw it as a step in the right direction, but others felt like it didn't go far enough.
Exactly. Critics argued that the report was incomplete, that it was politically motivated, and that it didn't hold anyone accountable. They also pointed out that downplaying China's role while emphasizing India, it felt like a way to avoid a much more sensitive issue.
It sounds like there's still a lot of debate about how to actually deal with these threats and what the right response should be. Was there anything in the Hogue report that everyone seemed to agree on?
One thing they did agree on was the threat of transnational repression.
What is transnational repression exactly?
It's basically when foreign governments try to silence or intimidate their critics who are living abroad. So let's say someone from Hong Kong fled to Canada seeking asylum, and then they suddenly find themselves facing threats or intimidation, maybe even having their assets frozen because of pressure from Beijing.
That's terrifying. So Canada is becoming a battleground for these authoritarian regimes to silence dissent and control their citizens, even when they're no longer living in their home country.
That's the worry. And the Hogue report specifically highlighted this as a major threat, particularly for Canadians from Hong Kong who are being targeted by Beijing.
This is heavy stuff. We've gone from cyber attacks and disinformation to underground casinos and potential political funding scandals, and now we're talking about transnational repression and the targeting of people seeking refuge in Canada.
Yeah, it's a lot. And it all points back to the same underlying issue. Foreign interference is happening in Canada, and it's happening on multiple levels. We're seeing attempts to manipulate elections, influence policy control, key sectors of the economy, even silence dissenting voices.
It's almost like Canada is being pulled in these two opposite directions, one towards a more open and democratic society, and the other towards a more authoritarian model, where dissent is stifled and those in power don't have to answer for their actions.
It's a powerful way to put it. And the question is, which direction will Canada ultimately choose?
It feels like we've just scratched the surface here, uncovered this whole hidden world operating beneath the surface of Canadian politics.
Yeah, and I think for a long time there's been this reluctance to even talk about foreign interference, especially when it comes to China.
Right. People don't want to seem, anti-China or spur up fear or anything like that, but it feels like we're at a point where the evidence is pretty overwhelming.
It is. It's happening, and it's impacting our democracy in real ways.
So what can we actually do about it? I mean, where do we even go from here?
Well, the Hague Commission made a bunch of recommendations, but a lot of people felt like they didn't go far enough.
Yeah, I've heard that criticism too. So what needs to happen?
We need stronger laws, better ways to enforce those laws, more transparency from our intelligence agencies so Canadians can understand what's going on.
That's a good point. It's hard to feel confident that things are being handled properly when so much of this happens in secret.
Exactly. And we need better public education, too. Canadians need to understand the tactics that are being used, the disinformation campaigns, the financial coercion, the ways they exploit diaspora communities.
So it's not just about the government taking action, it's also about individuals being more aware and more vigilant.
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility to protect our democracy.
I want to circle back to the idea of transnational repression for a second. It just seems like a particularly insidious form of interference because it targets individuals who are already vulnerable, often people who are fleeing persecution.
It is.
So what can Canada do to protect those individuals who are being targeted by foreign governments on Canadian soil?
The government needs to make it crystal clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. And that means taking a hard line against countries like China that are engaging in this kind of repression, using diplomatic tools to put pressure on them. And it means providing support to those who are targeted, whether it's legal aid, financial assistance, or even helping them relocate if necessary.
It's complicated, but it sounds like the bottom line is that Canada needs to be way more proactive. We can't afford to wait until it's too late.
I agree completely. The stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about the future of our democracy, the values that define us as a country.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really hope listeners take away from all of this?
A sense of urgency. This isn't some abstract geopolitical thing. It's happening right here, right now. It's affecting Canadians' lives. We need to pay attention, ask questions, demand action from our leaders. The future of our democracy depends on it.
That's a powerful message. And it's a responsibility we all share. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into foreign influence in Canada. We covered a lot of ground, but this conversation is far from over. Keep learning, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. 2019 I.